So again, it's great to see everyone here today. It's a little bit bigger, I think it was the last time before Easter, but anyways, it's still great to see the people are still returning. Anyways, we're just over halfway through the book of 2 Peter. Again, we've entitled it, What Sort of People? And we're in the second half of chapter 2, which again we're titling Bombastic, Ruined, Unreasoning Animals, which again you'll really see as we go through this what exactly it's talking about, as Peter basically continues on with the second half of chapter 2, really continuing on with what he said in the first half. But anyways, we'll start if you want to go ahead and stand up and we'll read through this together. He says, "These ones are as unreasoning animals, having been born instinctual beings into captivity and ruin, in which, speaking injuriously, they are being ignorant in their ruin. They also will be ruined, being injured the wage of unrighteousness, regarding the indulgence in the day a pleasure. They are spots and defects, indulging in their deceits, feasting together with you, having eyes full of adultery and eyes unceasing of sin, luring unestablished souls, having a heart, having been trained of greediness, children of a curse. Leaving behind the straight way, they went astray, having pursued the way of Balaam of Beor, who loved the wage of unrighteousness. But he had a rebuke of his own lawlessness. A mute donkey, having spoken in a human voice, hindered the madness of the prophet. These ones are waterless springs and fog banks, being driven by a strong wind, to whom the gloom of darkness has been reserved. For speaking excessive things in futility and the extreme immoral desires of the flesh, they are luring those barely escaping, the ones behaving themselves in error, promising freedom to them while they themselves are existing as slaves of corruption. For to whatever thing someone has succumbed, by this he has been enslaved. For if having escaped the defilements of the world in knowledge of the Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, but to these things they are succumbing, having again been entangled in them, the last things have become to them worse than the first things. For it was better to them to not have known the way of unrighteousness than having known to turn back out of the holy commandment, having been delivered to them. The things of the true proverb has happened to them, a dog having returned to its own vomit, and a sow having been washed into the wallowing of filth." So you may be seated. And as we go through that, you can sort of see what Peter's talking about specifically at the end there, where basically it all has to do with finishing things that are started. And that's not always the easiest thing in the world to do, is finish things that you start. Or at least I know I've had plenty of issues with it. I know I spoke about, I think it was in the introduction or one of the early sermons, about how my intentions with 2 Peter were to know it basically so well I could do this without really even thinking about it, studying up on it a lot. But it didn't really work out for time, energy, the fact that translating Acts way too much, and just a whole bunch of other things that sort of lead to that point where it's not always easy to finish things up. Or in other ways, I've struggled with it. I enjoy writing. It's something I just sort of do for fun, and there's been a million different stories or biblical things that I've begun, but most of them never really get past just the whole idea behind it. And if they do even get that far, they end up being stopped somewhere in the middle of it, or there's very few of them that make it all the way to the end of actually being finished. So it's not the easiest thing for me to finish the things I've begun, or even, again, you can consider the amount of Bible studies that I've tried to start writing lessons for and doing all that stuff for, but when it comes to lack of motivation because it's not coming up soon, it makes it harder to finish those things until there's actually a need for them, or at least that becomes something that I struggle with, and you probably have some sort of a struggle with that to some degree, of not finishing every little piece of thing that you started before, because again, it's not always, sometimes it's just time or other things that get in the way, that it's not even our own faults, but sometimes it's something within us that just doesn't allow us to get there. And I think that's ultimately one of the things that Peter's trying to get us to see in this section, is the reality that it's something that's very important, especially when it comes to following Christ, that it's the very thing that we need. And we'll see that as we go through here. And one of the, again, as I mentioned earlier, this is Peter continuing on in the second chapter of his book, that the whole entire thing really goes together. It was hard even to figure out how to fully break it up, and I still don't know sometimes that there are better ways to do it, but the whole idea is that Peter does make more than one point, even in the midst of trying to make one point. And again, if you know how long my sermon was last week, I don't want to know how long it would have been if we combined it all into one, which had been one of my thoughts early on. But anyways, the point is Peter is continue on describing the false prophets that he brought up in the first half of the chapter, and in the first half, we also saw that he showed how they're not getting away with the things that they're doing, and that God's able to keep those who are following him while also keeping at bay the ones who are being wicked, and they're ultimately being held to the final judgment, but even now they're under some form of judgment. And he sort of, at the very end of it, begins to describe them. He speaks of them as continuing on in excessive immorality, as well as not despising authority, and even blaspheming in ways that even angels wouldn't do. And from that point on, he continues on describing them when he says, "But these ones are as unreasoning animals, having been born instinctual beings into captivity and ruin, in which, speaking injuriously, they are being ignorant in their ruin. They also will be ruined, being injured, the wage of unrighteousness, regarding indulgence in the day of pleasure." It's the whole idea that, again, we can see the vast majority of the title actually showing up here, that they're unreasoning, ruined animals. We see in this very first section when he's describing them that it's sort of the very description of who these people are, the ones, the false prophets themselves, and even to a degree the ones following after them, fall into this same category of being unreasoning animals. Again, the description of them being animals or natural instinctual beings, however you want to put it, is sort of the similar way to when people are described as being like animals, because sometimes they begin to act that way, just going and doing whatever they want instead of actually following the morality that humans have that no other animal actually has. So there's that distinction there that some people choose to ignore. So again, they begin to look like that. And Peter sort of uses this actually throughout the entire thing. And at the very end, he comes back and finishes off by showing why that matters. As well, it speaks of them going towards their own ruin, which again, he brought up in the very first chapter, the first part of this chapter, that he spoke in the middle of that, basically saying that they were bringing it upon themselves. And again, he reminds us of that in them going towards their own ruin, that because of the things they're doing, they're causing themselves to head in that direction. And along with that ruin of them being injured, he calls it the wage of unrighteousness. This is similar to what Paul says when he says that the wages of sin is death, that because of the things they're doing, it leads to this wage of unrighteousness, which is ruin and being injured in that process. And the final thing to sort of note here is that very last phrase where it speaks of regarding the indulgence in the day of pleasure. It's something that even the pagans themselves or the non-Christians wouldn't even go out and do. That you can read in other places, like Ephesians mentions it, that certain things aren't even done in the light because they don't want people to know about them. But these people are fine with doing even those things during the day, basically, is sort of the description, that they go even further than most people would choose to go. And again, if you remember what I spoke about last week, 2 Peter connects so closely with Jude that just bringing these things in to help you understand it more fully. But he says, but Jude here says, but these people blaspheme all that they do not understand, and they are destroyed by all that they, like unreasoning animals, understand instinctually. So again, he says that same thing of being ruined because they're unreasoning animals. But I think the other point of blaspheming all that they don't understand is an important point, because we see that happening around us today with people who are atheists or who know a good portion of the Bible and can understand what it says in the sense of being read like any other ancient document, but they don't have the spiritual understanding behind it to understand what it's really saying. So they know just enough to be dangerous, but not enough to really get it. So it leads them to basically, again, blaspheme the part of it they don't understand, thinking that they do understand it in the first place, if that makes sense. I don't know if you've ever seen an example of it, but Again, basically, they take something like, even what I spoke of last week, because evil exists in the world, that means God doesn't exist, or that he just doesn't care about us. But yet, the real matter is, as Peter proved to us, God is doing something about it. It's just not always obvious if we're not paying attention to it, or recognizing that the eternal judgment's even greater than anything they could get now. And that's what it's pointing towards in general. So I think that's an important point to add, that Jude sort of adds a little more distinctly than Peter says in his version. And then again, it continues on, regarding the indulgence in the day of pleasure, that they are spots and defects, indulging in their deceits, fasting together or feasting together with you. It's interesting that if you've ever read much of the New Testament, it speaks of us supposed to be without spots and blemish. That word for defects is somewhat similar to blemish, and it's the whole idea that not just do they have those things, but they are those very things themselves. That the very things we're called not to be are what these people are themselves. And he almost seems to have a condemnation of the Christians there themselves. He doesn't directly say it, but basically they're allowing those people to continue in their midst and join in them with the feasts that they're having. And he's basically, in a roundabout way, telling them that they should get rid of them, that they shouldn't be allowing them to even do that in the first place. Again, he sort of parallels Jude here, where Jude says, these are hidden reefs at your love feasts as they feast together without fear. I think that second point, that without fear they are feasting together with them, shows the point that they're being accepted by the Christians there, who are just basically allowing them to continue on in this thing. And as well, when it speaks of that love feast, it's what's commonly now called the agape love feast, which they had, which basically was what they did a lot of the times when they met together. What typically was sometimes they would think of as their Sunday service type thing like we have now, was typically them meeting together to share probably an entire meal. At the very least, they were sharing communion, but it was probably a meal a lot of times. And that at those things, they were allowing those people to come and basically do whatever they want. And the very descriptions that he gives now may have been things they were even attempting to do at those very places. But he says, having eyes full of adultery and eyes unceasing of sin, luring unestablished souls, having a heart, having been trained of greediness, children of a curse. It's important to recognize that luring unestablished souls part is sort of the answer of how to avoid this to a degree. I don't know if you've ever noticed, but certain groups like cults often go after new Christians because they know just enough to know what Jesus did, and most cults have a somewhat similar belief system to that, or at least enough that they can claim they believe some of those things to lure you in, and you don't even realize the nonsense they have and the rest of it until you're already so in the middle of it that you can't do anything about it to turn away. And again, that's sort of the way that these false teachers as well act. They begin to teach you some of the same things that you already learned and know, but then they distort the rest of the Bible that you don't know yet and show you another way that they want to lead you in. And again, that's ultimately the point of what they're doing. So the whole idea is that to avoid that, we have to not just have our own selves established, but be establishing the others amongst us so that they don't fall into that same trap. But the other things that it mentions here of them having eyes full of adultery, eyes unceasing of sin, and a heart trained towards greediness sort of mirrors the things that people like to go after in our own day, the power, the sex, and the money, that those things are what typically drive most people in one way or another. And those are the very things that these people are doing themselves. And that, again, that's just one more reason to avoid them. And he actually sort of gives an example of this greediness when he goes on to say, leaving behind the straight way, they went astray, having pursued the way of Balaam of Beor, who loved the wage of unrighteousness. But he had a rebuke of his own lawlessness. A mute donkey, having spoken in a human voice, hindered the madness of the prophet. Again, if you want to learn more about that, you can go and read in Numbers 22 about that. I guess the story continues on even from there, but that's sort of the more point of what he's focusing on. But I'll just give you a brief summary that basically the king of Moab, I believe it was, wanted Balaam, who was a prophet, to help him curse Israel. Balaam did try a few times, but he wasn't able to do it. He actually even prophesied even about Jesus' coming. which is sort of interesting, alluded to earlier in 1 Peter. It spoke about a star coming, and it's probably an allusion to Numbers 24, which was what Balaam had said. But anyways, ultimately, he wasn't able to curse Israel, though he did give them, the king of Moab, a way to trick Israel into following along and doing some of their idolatrous practices. But anyways, the whole point is that it seemed that the reason he did it because he wanted the money that was being offered to him by the king of Moab. So that was his whole purpose behind doing that. And Jude sort of explains that when he says, "Woe to them, for they walked in the way of Cain and abandoned themselves for the sake of gain to Balaam's heir and perished in Korah's rebellion." For the sake of gain to Balaam's heir, again, it points towards it being that greediness and the want for money that he was doing. And again, these false teachers go about things in that same way. And again, I think I might have mentioned this in the first half of chapter 2, but again, that's what the false teachers do now more than anything, is that they do it for the money. Whether or not it's just all about the money or just because they want to have money coming in at all, they don't want to teach the truth because it oftentimes turns people away. So that's one of the important things to notice there. It is interesting that Jude actually includes two other examples of Cain and Korah's rebellion. Obviously, Cain was the one who killed his brother out of jealousy. So again, they oftentimes go in the way of jealousy or even killing people if they get in their way or don't like them, basically. They do something about it. And it speaks of them perishing in Korah's rebellion, which ultimately sort of goes back to almost that despising authority. It was a group of people who rose up against Moses, saying that he didn't actually have the authority from God. And ultimately what happened is God showed that Moses really was the one who was his own, and the earth came and actually swallowed the people up in the rebellion. So that's sort of the point of what he's pointing at, that they will perish in that same sort of manner, that again, as we said before, they're not going to get away with the things that they're doing, even if it looks like that for certain periods of time. And he sort of finishes up this description of the false prophets saying, "These ones are waterless springs and fog banks, being driven by strong wind, to whom the gloom of darkness has been reserved." It's sort of interesting description he says there of waterless springs, that basically, what you expect to get out of a spring is water. So the fact that they're waterless is it has the appearance of being something worthwhile without the actual substance or the content of it. Again, it's oftentimes what false preachers are able to do. They have a look like they're actually doing the right thing, or they're teaching the right thing, or they're good at speaking or whatever, but the content behind it isn't actually there, so they're giving you nothing in return. Again, Jude mirrors him, saying, we read the first part earlier, but anyways, he says, "These are hidden reefs at your love feast, as they feast with you without fear, shepherds feeding themselves, waterless clouds, swept along by winds, fruitless trees in late autumn, twice dead, uprooted, wild waves of the sea, casting up the foam of their own shame, wandering stars, for whom the gloom of utter darkness has been reserved for forever." So again, he really hits it even harder there. Jude sort of goes a lot further than Peter does in his own, but again, the waterless clouds or the fruitless trees, it's the form of having what it's supposed to have without the actual substance of having it in the first place. It almost seems similar to what Jesus said to the Pharisees about being whitewashed tombs, that they looked pretty on the outside, but on the inside they were completely dead and weren't able to be doing the very thing they were supposed to. And again, he reminds us, just as Peter did, that for whom the gloom of utter darkness has been reserved for them. Again, it's a reminder that even in the first half of the chapter, he spoke of that it was already reserved for them, that it seems like they may even be the ones specifically more so for whom it was made, because of the things that they're doing and basically leading others along with them to that very place. And then in verse 18, Peter sort of slightly shifts directions in what he's saying. He more goes to some of the things that people are doing rather than sort of more their character or who they are. It's not a major shift, but it's just slightly different the way he's saying things. But anyways, he says, "For speaking excessive or bombastic things of futility in the extreme immoral desires of the flesh, they are luring those barely escaping the ones behaving themselves in error." Again, obviously we have bombastic there because Joel loves the word now, and because Sierra doesn't like it, so But anyways, the whole point is that it's excessive or just way overboard, just going beyond anything that's actually necessary, along with it being things that lead to futility. Again, as I sort of said before, they seem to be good speakers, and they can go on and saying things, but because there's no substance in it, it's not actually helpful towards anyone. But because they seem to do it well, people more go towards them, or they're the ones who are good at persuasive speaking, so people will believe things they say no matter the truth behind it. That sort of seems to be what they're saying. As well, again, when it speaks of them going in the immoral desires of the flesh, that through that they're luring those, that through the things that they're doing, it lures the people in because they have some desire for them. But again, it seems to be pointing back again to new Christians. It says they're luring those barely escaping the ones behaving themselves in error. It's sort of unclear exactly who that last phrase is referring to. I think when we translated it, we actually have a comma between them, so we thought it was the same group of people. But because of the way it's written, it could actually be, basically they're luring those in who just barely got out of their sin. The ones behaving themselves in error, the ones still over here living in their sin, and they just barely had gotten out of it and moved over to begin following Christ. And that's basically the easiest point to pull someone back in, because they're not very far away from it, and they still have that draw towards the sin itself. And that's sort of what he's saying, is that those are the very ones that they're luring right back to the very thing that they came from, because there's still somewhat of a little bit of a lure back in that direction to do those things that they used to be doing. And along with that, it's because they're promising freedom to them while they themselves are existing as slaves of corruption. Again, this is one thing we can really see today, that people like to basically go on the fact that because of what Jesus did on the cross, we can live in whatever way we want, or they take the word freedom that's given and they just take it to an ultimate extreme beyond anything of what it's actually supposed to mean. And while in the midst, they themselves are, again, existing as slaves of corruption because they're living in that very sin, and it's enslaving them because they're just forced to continue in it because, again, as he says in the second half, for to whatever things someone has succumbed, by this he has been enslaved. And it's the whole idea that if something's overcome you or ultimately controlling you, that very thing is the thing that's enslaved you. And again, these people, because their sins are those things, they have enslaved them. That though they promise and make it look like there's actually freedom in what they're doing, they're just becoming slaves all over again in a different manner. But this is something that's actually mirrored elsewhere in Scripture. Paul in Romans says, "Do you not know that if you present yourselves to anyone as obedient slaves, you are slaves of the one whom you obey, either of sin, which leads to death, or of obedience, which leads to righteousness?" It's the whole idea that you're a slave to whatever you're following. So if you're following Christ, then you're a slave to Christ, as it says elsewhere. And if you're following sin, you're just a slave to it, that you can't do anything else besides it to get out of it. So again, that's exactly what the very thing Peter's saying here. He doesn't really give the positive example that Paul does, but it's still the whole idea to that very thing you're following is the thing you're enslaved to. So even if they're making it look like it's actually freedom, recognize that it's still truly sin itself, and you're just going right back into being enslaved in sin, and it's not accomplishing you anything. As well, Jesus answered them, "Truly, truly, I say to you, everyone who practices sin is a slave to sin." So again, it's repeated even by Jesus himself, that when we're enslaved to sin because we're practicing it, that if you're living in it, you're enslaved to it. And again, that's Peter's whole point and what he's trying to get through to them, that it might look good, it might look like the thing you want, they might claim that you can do it because there's freedom, but in reality, you're just going back into the very same thing you have. It's just wrapped in a different gift wrapping, or however you want to put it. He continues on again, saying, "For if, having escaped the defilements of the world in knowledge of the Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, but to these things they are succumbing, having again been entangled in them, the last things have become to them worse than the first." So again, as I was speaking of that they're luring those who just barely got out of it, but it's the whole idea that they were over here living in sin, doing whatever they wanted, and they had come over to actually begin following Christ in one manner or another. Again, oftentimes people like to claim that they were never saved in the first place if they go back. I don't really think that it says that here, but that's not ultimately the entire point. Something happened and they began looking towards Christ, and it seems that they really were following him since they escaped the defilements of the world. But the whole idea is that they then went back to it, having again become succumbed to it, having been entangled in those very same things they were doing again. And because of that, Peter can describe them as the last things being worse than the first, that it's worse for them now in this state than it was for them in the beginning. And he describes that by saying, "For it is better for them to have not known the way of righteousness than having known to turn back out of the holy commandment, having been delivered to them." Again, he makes it very clear that it would have been better if they would have just never done anything in the first place, have just continued to live in their sin, rather than have turned and gone towards Christ and at the very least looked like they were living in it, but it seems that they were probably fully living in it in some form of a commitment, to then have gone all the way back over here just to do the same things they'd done before. That there may have been a desire to do that, but because they love this more than that, it brought them back in this direction. And again, it speaks of them having turned back out of the holy commandment. He's basically trying to show how far they went, that they went and wanted to do something with God, but they decided they didn't want it anymore, just to go back to the very things they were doing before. And again, this is the very danger that what he was speaking about before, of them luring the unestablished ones, that if we don't get ourselves established, it's easy to fall for those things, to go back into the sin, because again, there's always some sort of allure that we have to get back in that direction. Even if it lessens as we grow in Christ, there's still something that pulls us in that direction typically. He finishes off this by saying, "The thing of the true proverb has happened to them, a dog having returned to its own vomit, and a sow having been washed into the wallowing of filth." Again, he quotes Proverbs with the first one of a dog having returned to its vomit. Again, basically what he's describing is sort of the character of the people that do this, because they love that so much, their sin so much in the first place, that even though they got over here, they didn't, basically they were choosing not to allow God to change them enough to get that rid of it, so they just go back to the very thing that they were doing in the first place, because it has too much of a draw to them. The second one is from some other extra biblical source, but it speaks of a sow having been washed, again, sort of as we're cleansed and coming to Christ, just going right back to the very things that it was doing before, because it desires the mud and all the other junk that's in it to just roll around in it, because having been washed wasn't the way it really wanted to be. Even if it might have been nice for a moment, their draw is still back to the thing that they were doing before. And that's how it is for these same people. The draw is just too much for them to stay away from it. And again, it's why they are called bombastic, ruined, unreasoning animals, because that's the very description for what these people are basically doing. I know it sounds harsh and almost overboard, but that's sort of the point of it, because they don't recognize the truth behind God and who He is and all those things, and they just want to live in their own sin. So it's sort of interesting as we ask the question of what sort of people we ought to be with this very point. It sort of connects closely with what we spoke about last week. I don't know if you remember it as we got to this part. Sort of to answer that question, obviously, the ultimate thing that he was telling them was to be the righteous ones as opposed to the unrighteous ones. But he didn't really define either side what the righteous or the unrighteous meant. It was more of a you should know. This time he goes and clearly describes who the unrighteous are. Again, the bombastic, ruined, unreasoning animals, the ones who are continuing to do these things, or even worse, the ones who came out of doing them just to go right back into doing it all over again. That those were the kinds of people that we're not supposed to be. But yet we also have to recognize at the same time that no matter how you come to Christ, there's still always that lure to go back there. That some people, like Bob, have more dramatic experiences where things are taken away and they don't have those same desires that they had before. So in some senses, it's easier to not go back to do some of those things. But of course, the reality is, as Jesus says, from someone who is given much, much is expected, that if they go back, it's worse than someone who just sort of falls back in. Other people come out of it and we're fully in it, just about as far as you could be in the sin, to come over and change, but they still struggle with that lure to go back in. That even though, typically because they haven't come out of it very long or whatever, that there's still something there, even if they're truly desiring to follow Christ, because, again, they knew it so much and it's what they grew up knowing. Or there are people who grew up as Christians or grew up knowing about God who, some of them just go rebel entirely and go away and then come back. Or some of them who don't really ever do that, but there's still always that draw, more or less wondering what it would actually be like to do that in the first place because they never actually experienced it. That there's always some sort of allure to go back in that very direction. And that's what we have to be careful of, that we don't choose to fully go that way, to become those bombastic, ruined, unreasoning animals. And it's always going to be a struggle for us. And again, Peter's telling us here that those are the sort of people we ought not to be. But he doesn't give us necessarily the ones we're supposed to be. But I think in Colossians, Paul describes it very well for what that looks like. He says, "And you being formerly once, having been alienated and enemies by thought in the evil works, but now reconciled in the body of his flesh through the death, to present you holy and blameless and unaccusable before him." It's the whole idea that, again, they came out of doing what they were doing to be in Christ. Again, as Paul actually describes earlier in Colossians, they came from the kingdom of darkness, or the dominion of darkness, in the kingdom of his Son, that God did that for them. But basically what they do is they chose to go back to it, as he qualifies his statement here. "If you continually or persistently remain by trust, having been established firmly, or having been founded and steadfast, and not shifting yourselves or moving yourselves away from the hope of the good news of which you heard, the one proclaimed in every creature under heaven, of which I myself, Paul, became a servant." Again, it's the whole idea that they made that choice to go away from practicing their sin, to turn to Christ, but we still, once we're in that point, have to choose to remain. Again, it's that whole idea that I started off with, that we have to finish that very thing we started, which is why Jesus in the Gospel speaks of counting the cost before we choose to do it. Because again, it's way worse if we start and choose to turn back than if we choose not to start in the first place. But the whole idea is that the ones we're supposed to be are the ones who choose to continue to remain in him. So again, it brings up that final question of not just who we ought to be, but what sort of people are you going to choose to be? Are you going to choose to go back or continue in wherever you are now to be those bombastic, ruined, unreasoning animals who are just doing whatever they want because they feel like it doing it? Or are you going to choose to be the ones who are remaining in Christ because you want to follow him with everything, and again, to choose daily to remain in that, because that's ultimately what we have to do if we choose to go that way. So ultimately the choice is up to you guys.